You think moving to a new home means starting fresh, right? But what if your seemingly peaceful neighborhood hides someone who can turn your world upside down? This is the chilling story of Kay, a mentally unstable neighbor whose eerie actions will keep you on edge until the very last word. I want to share the unsettling story of my mentally unstable neighbor, whom I'll call Kay to respect her privacy. This is not an attempt to stigmatize mental illness or exaggerate for effect. It's just the unvarnished truth of what happened. We had just moved into our newly built home in a Texas town when strange events began. My parents discovered small pills scattered in our backyard near the fence. There weren't many, just a few here and there. Curious and worried about our dog, we Googled the pill numbers and found they were mostly antidepressants, though one was identified as an anticholinergic medication. This baffled us, but we hoped it was a one-off incident. The mystery deepened over the next few weeks. Unopened water bottles and Gatorade began appearing in our yard, thrown over the fence. This couldn't have been construction workers from the new house being built next door, as the bottles were sealed and untouched. Around this time, Kay, who lived a few houses down, started drawing attention. She'd storm out to the construction site, yelling nonsensically at the workers. Sometimes she'd shout from her yard, other times she'd walk onto the lot and yell amidst the supplies. Neighbors reported seeing her argue with no one, pacing in the empty lot as if she were in a heated debate. Despite all this, I hadn't met Kay yet. I was attending university an hour away and was home only on weekends. One weekend, while my parents were out, I was alone at home. Fresh from a shower, I heard yelling outside. Peeking through the window, I saw a middle-aged blonde woman, Kay, arguing with a man. Assuming it was our new neighbors, I decided not to intervene. After the argument, the couple left, but the man came to our door, leaving a note. Curious and a little uneasy, I read it after he left. The note revealed that Kay had been trying to get into our backyard. Alarmed, I called my mom and sent her a photo of the note. Although my parents didn't seem overly concerned, the thought of Kay attempting to enter the house while I was alone terrified me. My stepdad immediately installed new locks on our gates. Kay's strange behavior continued. She'd rummage through our flower beds, throw pills and bottles over the fence, and was even spotted by a neighbor lurking near our back gate at 3 a.m. These incidents became increasingly disturbing, especially when we learned more about her. The builder of our house, whom I'll call Jay, had connections with Kay's family. According to him, Kay came from a wealthy family that owned a major corporation. 2 years earlier, she'd lost her only son to a drug overdose, which exacerbated her mental instability. Her family, unwilling to deal with her condition, placed her in our neighborhood. Kay believed her son's spirit was in our backyard, which explained her attempts to enter and the pills she threw her discarded medication. The situation escalated in January 2020. During another outburst at the construction site, Kay pulled out a BB gun, threatening the workers. The police were called, and while they handled the situation with remarkable sensitivity given her condition, it was clear she needed help. She was taken to a psychiatric hospital, where she stayed for several months. When Kay returned, she was a different person. She no longer exhibited her bizarre behavior. These days, she walks her dog past our house, sticking to a routine. I'm genuinely glad she's doing better now. This experience taught me a lot about the complexities of mental illness and the importance of empathy, even when fear and confusion dominate. Kay's story reminds us that there's often a heartbreaking reason behind someone's actions, one that deserves understanding rather than judgment. Have you ever trusted someone so deeply, only to discover they have been watching your every move? This is the chilling story of a seemingly friendly neighbor whose horrifying secret shattered the peace of a young couple's life. After getting married, my wife and I moved into a small house on a quiet street. It was a cozy, single-story home with 2 bedrooms. We were planning to have children soon, so the second bedroom was intended for that. Despite the small size of the house, the lot was spacious, with plenty of trees and greenery, a feature I particularly loved. The neighbors were friendly, and everything seemed perfect at first. Across the street lived Jack, an older man who appeared to be in his mid-60s. He was single and lived alone. Jack had a warm and approachable demeanor. He always dressed like a grandfather or a retired professor, wearing plaid dress shirts under cardigan sweaters or sweater vests, occasionally accessorized with a bow tie. He walked with a slight hunch, making him seem even shorter than his medium height. Jack was fascinating. He once co-owned a construction company but later sold his share to a partner and spent the next couple of decades working at a used bookstore. I admired his choice to pursue something he loved over chasing wealth. Being in my mid-20s, I saw Jack as a grandfather figure, and over time we became good friends. He often invited my wife and me over for dinner, and we reciprocated. One Friday night, we were at Jack's house for dinner. As usual, we were having a great time. Dinner wasn't ready yet, so I excused myself to use the restroom. On my way, I passed Jack's office. His laptop was open and glowing on the desk. For reasons I can't explain, I felt an irresistible urge to look. After ensuring no one was watching, I tiptoed into the office and sat at his desk. Guilt gnawed at me, but my curiosity won. I started with his browsing history. It was surprisingly clean, almost too clean. Then I opened his photos folder, and my heart dropped. Among his pictures, I found a shot of the outside of my house. As I scrolled, I discovered more dozens, possibly hundreds, all taken at night from various angles. What truly chilled me was the progression of the photos. In one, I could see the faint outline of my wife standing behind a curtain. Another image was taken right outside our bedroom window. My stomach churned when I found a photo of my wife and me sleeping. The picture was taken from the foot of our bed. Jack had been sneaking into our house. I slammed the laptop shut and stormed back to the dining room, trembling. Jack was sitting with my wife, chatting casually, as if nothing was wrong. My wife, blissfully unaware, smiled at me. I couldn't speak. I simply grabbed her hand and walked out the front door, leaving my shoes behind. My wife, confused but trusting, followed. Once we were home, I told her everything. That very night, we packed a few essentials and checked into a motel. We sold the house as quickly as possible and never looked back. This was the most terrifying experience of my life. To this day, I shudder to think what Jack's intentions were. If I hadn't discovered those photos, who knows how far he would have gone. Thankfully, we escaped in time. Imagine moving into your dream apartment, only to wake up one night with the chilling realization that someone has been in your home. This story will make you double-check every lock and every door because sometimes safety is just an illusion. I moved out of my parents' house later than most. My family relocated to the United States from Eastern Europe when I was a baby, and my parents held on to traditional values, particularly when it came to me, their daughter. It took a lot of convincing before my father finally allowed me to live on my own. I was 24 when I rented my first apartment, a modest, one-bedroom unit in a high-rise near a major bus terminal in our city. The building was one of 2 identical towers, each standing 20 floors tall, with balconies on every apartment except those on the ground floor. My apartment was on the 14th floor, offering a beautiful view of the highway below. The balcony, separated from my neighbors by a solid concrete wall, was a decent size with a glass and metal railing. I loved the privacy. With no nearby buildings, I felt free to step outside without worrying about being watched. During my first week, I made a point to introduce myself to some of the neighbors. Most were young professionals like me, and I even made a few friends early on. However, one neighbor immediately made me uneasy. His name was Gary. He lived right next door, was about 40 years old, and had the build of an ex-football player gone slightly to seed. Stocky, with a short beard and a perpetually backward baseball cap, Gary struck me as strange for reasons I couldn't fully articulate. We met for the first time in the hallway outside our apartments. From the moment he spoke, I felt uneasy. He seemed overly friendly but also oddly insistent. Within minutes, he asked me out. Flustered, I declined as politely as I could, not wanting to antagonize someone who shared a wall with me. Over the next few weeks, I kept running into Gary far too often to feel like it was just coincidence. It always seemed to happen as I was leaving my apartment, whether I was heading to work or simply waiting for the elevator. At first, I thought I was being paranoid, but over time the pattern became undeniable. I began to suspect he was listening for the sound of my door. One night, everything escalated. I had gone to bed early, around 9 p.m., and was fast asleep by 10. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up abruptly. I was groggy and disoriented, but had a strong sense that I wasn't alone. The room was silent, but the feeling of another presence was overpowering. I sat up and scanned the darkness. My heart pounded as I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam of light revealed nothing unusual in the room. Still, the sense of being watched was unbearable. Suddenly, I heard footsteps running, followed by the unmistakable slam of my front door. Frozen in place, I strained to listen. Moments later, I heard Gary's door slam shut as well. My mind raced. Had Gary just been in my apartment? How had he gotten in? I didn't have an answer, but I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't staying there another night. I called my parents and told them everything. They insisted I come home immediately, so I packed a bag and left, locking the door behind me. The next day, I returned with my father to collect the rest of my belongings. I tried to retrace Gary's possible steps, and one horrifying realization struck me: my balcony door had been unlocked. I never thought to secure it because I'd assumed it was inaccessible. The concrete wall separating our balcony seemed like an impenetrable barrier, but it was just low enough for someone determined to climb over. Needless to say, I moved back in with my parents and never spent another night in that apartment. When we went back to retrieve my things, Gary was nowhere to be seen. He didn't so much as peek out of his door. Looking back, I feel grateful that nothing worse happened that night. I can only imagine what Gary's intentions might have been, but I'm glad I never had to find out. The experience left me shaken, and to this day I always double-check that every door and window in my home is locked tight, especially the ones I used to think were unreachable. Imagine walking home on a quiet street, only to find yourself being followed by someone who already knows where you live. This is the unsettling story of a neighborhood menace whose actions terrified an entire community. When I was around 12, I had a neighbor who lived just a street down from me. He was an adult man who lived with his father because he couldn't afford his own place. At first, this didn't seem like a problem. Life can be tough, after all. But as time passed, he began doing something truly disturbing. He would stare into people's windows. Sometimes he even peeked inside. Naturally, this behavior terrified the neighborhood. The police were called on him multiple times, and he was arrested a handful of times for minor offenses. As rumors of his behavior spread, parents became hesitant to let their kids play outside. Even with these warnings, Nothing could have prepared me for the day I met him face to face. My younger brother, who was 10 at the time, and I were walking home from our grandparents' house. It was just a short walk, and we decided to enjoy the fresh air rather than catch a ride with our mom, who was driving back separately. As we turned onto our small cul-de-sac, we noticed the man's car driving by. I whispered to my brother, "That's him." "No way. Really?" My brother asked, with the wide-eyed curiosity only a 10-year-old could have. Then, in his childlike boldness, he yelled at the man's moving car, which had its windows down. I don't think either of us believed he actually heard us. But he did. The man's car slowed down, made a U-turn, and began following us. It was a moment of disbelief and fear. I froze for a second before yelling to my brother. "Run!" We sprinted toward our house as fast as we could. By the time we reached the garage, our mom was there, waiting for us. She hadn't noticed what happened, but we ran into her arms, breathless and shaking. The man drove into the cul-de-sac, made a loop, and then left, going the way he came. But now he knew exactly where we lived. That night, our family stayed close together, nervously wondering if he was lurking nearby. Thankfully, he never came, at least not that we knew of. 2 weeks later, he was arrested for doing something inappropriate to a woman at Walmart. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. A year later, he returned to the neighborhood, and once again, his unsettling presence loomed over our lives. Rumors swirled about his behavior, but no one seemed to know the full truth. To this day, I don't know what ultimately became of him. The fear he instilled in our community left a lasting impact on all of us. Even now, I can't help but look over my shoulder when walking alone, wondering if he's still out there, haunting someone else's quiet street. What if someone tried to break into your apartment while you were sleeping, and their intent wasn't just robbery? This chilling story will remind you why locking your doors is more than just a habit, it's a necessity. When I was younger, I lived in the downtown core of a large city. Anyone who has lived there knows how tiny some apartments can be. Space is at such a premium that landlords do everything they can to cram as many people as possible into the smallest areas. My apartment was no exception. It was so small that my bed was positioned right next to the front door. In fact, all I really had was a bed and a desk. I worked from home, so those two pieces of furniture were the bare essentials for my life at the time. Money was tight, and this apartment was all I could afford. In total, I lived there for about 5 years. That's longer than most tenants stayed in that building. The turnover rate was high. Students, travelers, and young professionals would come and go constantly. I had my fair share of neighbors over the years, but none were as unsettling as the man named Fred. Fred was in his 50s, tall with bad posture that made him appear shorter than he actually was. If he ever straightened his back, I imagine he would have been at least 6'2". He had long, greasy gray hair that fell to his shoulders and a thick, unkempt beard. Fred always wore the same plaid button-down shirt, almost as if it were a uniform. The first time I met Fred, I introduced myself. His reaction immediately gave me bad vibes. He acted as though even saying hello to me was a massive inconvenience. He wouldn't even tell me his name until I explicitly asked. I chalked it up to social awkwardness, something I could relate to on some level, and didn't think much of it at the time. But what happened next made me realize Fred's demeanor was far more sinister. One day, I was sitting at my desk working when I heard someone walk up to my door. Since my apartment was at the very end of the hall, it was rare for anyone to pass by unless they were coming to see me. Curious, I looked up from my computer just as someone tried to open my door. I heard the doorknob jiggle 2 or 3 times, followed by one firm push. My heart raced. Thankfully, I had remembered to lock the door. After realizing it wouldn't budge, whoever was on the other side gave up. I sat there for a moment, frozen, staring at the door. Slowly, I tiptoed over and peeked through the peephole. The hallway seemed empty. Cautiously, I cracked the door open just enough to stick my head out and look down the corridor. That's when I saw Fred walking away, carrying an empty duffel bag. My stomach dropped. What could he have been planning? The thought of Fred being that close to me while I slept, separated only by a locked door, sent chills down my spine. From that moment on, I made sure my door was always locked, no matter what. I later talked to one of my neighbors about Fred, and to my horror, they told me this wasn't the first time he had done something like that. Apparently, Fred had a habit of walking around the building and trying random door handles, hoping someone had left theirs unlocked. While there were no reports of him succeeding, the mere idea of what he might do if he did succeed kept me up at night. From that day forward, I avoided Fred at all costs. I never confronted him about what happened, but every so often I'd wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I'd heard someone trying my door again. Sometimes I'd get up to check, peering through the peephole into the empty hallway. Other times I'd force myself to stay in bed, hoping it was just my imagination. I never caught Fred in the act again, but I still wonder how many times he tried my door during those 5 years. To this day, I'll never forget the eerie feeling of knowing someone was just inches away from me, separated only by the thin metal lock of a cheap apartment door. What if you found out someone had been watching your every move for months, capturing your private moments without you ever suspecting a thing? This disturbing story will make you think twice about keeping your curtains open. A few years ago, my wife and I lived in the city, in a sleek, ultra-modern apartment building. It was one of those places with floor-to-ceiling windows and Wi-Fi built into every appliance. The building was surrounded by other high-rises, all packed closely together. It was a bustling downtown area, and privacy was practically non-existent. From our windows, we could see right into several of our neighbors' apartments, and they could see into ours. For the first few months, we were careful to keep the curtains closed most of the time. But we had a lot of houseplants, and they needed sunlight. Gradually, we started leaving the curtains open more often during the day. It wasn't ideal, but we grew used to it. The light made our home feel less claustrophobic, and life went on without incident. At least that's what we thought. One evening, my wife came home from work in a fit of panic. She was crying, barely able to get the words out. She immediately ran to the window and yanked the curtains shut, then turned to me and said, "We need to move." Now. I asked her what was wrong, but she could hardly speak. After a few minutes of trying to calm her down, she managed to explain. Earlier that day, she had received an anonymous email containing a link to a website. The site was filled with hours of video footage of us inside our apartment, all taken through our windows. My stomach dropped as she described it. Someone had been watching us, recording our private lives, and uploading it for others to see. I couldn't believe it. I had to see it for myself. Reluctantly, my wife showed me the website. It was worse than I imagined. There we were in our most mundane moments, watching TV, cooking dinner, even just sitting on the couch. The realization that someone had been watching us without our knowledge made me feel sick. I slammed the laptop shut and walked over to the window. Peeking through a tiny crack in the curtains, I scanned the buildings across from ours. At first I saw nothing unusual, but then, in one of the apartments directly opposite ours, I noticed the faint glint of a camera lens. My heart raced. that was it. We called the police immediately and filed a report. We even showed them the website, hoping they could trace it back to whoever was responsible. Unfortunately, there wasn't much they could do. They advised us to keep our curtains closed and be vigilant. We felt helpless. Knowing that someone had been invading our privacy so blatantly made it impossible to feel safe in our own home. My wife and I decided to move as soon as we could. Within a month, we found a new place on the outskirts of the city, far away from prying eyes. It was a smaller, older apartment, but it felt like a sanctuary compared to what we'd left behind. To this day, I'm haunted by the thought of how long that person had been watching us and what their intentions might have been. We'll never know the full extent of what they saw or why they did it, but one thing is certain: I'll never leave my curtains open again. Have you ever trusted a familiar face only to realize they had sinister intentions? This haunting story of a neighbor-turned-intruder will leave you questioning everyone around you. When I was a child, I lived with my grandparents in a small, peaceful town. My parents had separated, and my dad worked in the next town over, so I only saw him on weekends. My uncle, my dad's brother, also lived with us, meaning I was rarely ever left alone at such a young age. My grandparents were very protective, and they taught me never to answer the door for strangers. Our town was quiet, and everyone knew each other by name. Among our neighbors was a man named David. He was a family friend who often visited to watch hockey night in Canada, drink beer with my uncle, or help my grandpa with yard work. David was always around, so much so that I thought of him as a trusted neighbor. One night, however, David's presence took a dark turn. My grandma had gone to bingo, and my grandpa left to pick her up. Before leaving, he asked if I wanted to come along for the ride. I declined, preferring to stay home and watch cartoons. "Don't unlock the door for anyone," he reminded me before driving off. Not even 5 minutes after they left, there was a knock at the door. I ran to the front and called out, "Who is it?" "It's David," came the familiar voice. "Let me in." "Grandma and Grandpa aren't home right now," I replied through the door. "I know," he said. I saw them leave. "I just need to come in for a minute." I hesitated. I'm not supposed to open the door for anyone. I'm not a stranger. You know me. Let me in, he insisted. He was right. I did know him. He was practically part of the family. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door and opened it. David stepped inside, towering over me. He was swaying slightly, and I could tell he was drunk. He placed his hands on my shoulders, his grip firm enough to make me uncomfortable. "What's wrong?" I asked nervously. Instead of answering, David dragged me into the kitchen. He opened a drawer and pulled out a large knife. My stomach churned as he pressed the flat side of the blade against my belly. "Do you want to get stabbed?" he asked menacingly. Terrified, I started to cry. He told me to be quiet or he'd cut out my tongue. He mimed slicing my throat with the knife, showing me he wasn't joking. My heart pounded as I tried to think of a way to escape. Just then, I heard the familiar sound of my grandpa's truck pulling into the driveway. Relief washed over me, but before I could scream for help, David clamped his hand over my mouth. He turned us toward the door, his knife still in hand. The front door opened, and my grandma walked in with a cheerful smile that quickly faded when she saw us. She screamed for my grandpa, who rushed inside moments later. His booming voice filled the room. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded. David tried to maintain control, but my grandpa's sheer presence was enough to intimidate him. My grandpa charged at him, and David pushed me to the floor. My grandma scooped me up and held me tightly as my grandpa physically forced David out of the house. "Don't ever come back here, you son of a." My grandpa roared as he slammed the door behind him. That night I learned that David had been watching our house, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He knew my uncle wasn't home, my grandma was at bingo, and my grandpa would be gone briefly to pick her up. It was all part of his plan. After that incident, I never saw David again. My family never called the police, and we never talked about it. Years later, after my grandpa passed away, I brought up that terrifying night to my grandma. She seemed uneasy and said it had been a very scary experience for everyone. "Do you remember that Grandpa went out hunting that night?" she asked. I vaguely recalled it, but didn't think much of it at the time. Looking back, I can't help but wonder if David truly disappeared on his own, or if my grandpa made sure he wouldn't bother us or anyone else ever again. To this day, I'm grateful for my grandpa's strength and bravery, but I'll always carry the memory of how close I came to harm. Have you ever had the unsettling feeling of being watched, only to find out you weren't imagining it? This story takes you into the chilling reality of living under surveillance by someone just across the way. I had just finished college when this happened. My girlfriend and I had moved into a small, cozy apartment in a new city. It had just enough space for the two of us, and we were excited to start fresh, creating new memories in our little home. I had taken a job at an insurance company. It wasn't my ideal work, but the student loans I had were larger than I cared to admit, so I accepted the highest paying job I could find. My girlfriend hadn't found work yet, but she was actively looking. The building we lived in was older but well maintained. It was a U-shaped structure with only 5 stories surrounding a parking lot in the middle. Our apartment was on the first floor. The view wasn't much to brag about, as the windows faced other people's apartments from all directions. It felt like we were on display for the rest of the building. We quickly settled in and started to feel at home. But after a few weeks, I began to sense that something was off. One evening, while cooking dinner, I noticed the blinds in the apartment across from ours were slightly open, revealing a small, silvery glint. At first I brushed it off, thinking it was nothing, but then it happened again the next evening, and the one after that. That's when I began to wonder if someone was watching us. Initially I thought I was being paranoid. It was such a subtle thing, barely noticeable. But over time, I became convinced that someone was spying on us. I started catching glimpses of movement behind the blinds in that apartment. I told my girlfriend about it, and she agreed it was strange and unsettling. We decided to speak to our landlord about it. The landlord listened to our concerns, but told us there wasn't much he could do without solid evidence. Frustrated but without any proof, we left the conversation feeling helpless. One night, my girlfriend and I were staying up late watching TV. It was around midnight when the blinds in the apartment across from ours suddenly opened. For the first time, we saw a shadowy figure inside. We froze, peering through our own blinds, and soon the light in the other apartment turned on. The figure moved into full view. It was a man, someone I'd seen around the building but had never spoken to. He looked to be about 30 years old, with dark hair and thick glasses. His face had a constant frown, as if smiling was an impossible task for him. He stared directly at us. There was no doubt now he knew we were there, and he wanted us to know it. The following night, my girlfriend and I were asleep in our bedroom. Our bed was positioned next to the window, and we always kept the curtains shut. Sometime in the middle of the night, I was awakened by a tapping sound on the glass. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. while my girlfriend remained fast asleep. Slowly, I peeked through the curtains, and there he was, our neighbor, standing just outside the window. The dim light from the building illuminated half of his face, creating an unnervingly menacing appearance. I closed the curtains as quickly as I could and grabbed my phone to call the police. They arrived soon after, but by the time they got there, our neighbor had disappeared. We filed a report and informed our landlord about the incident the next day. As terrifying as that night had been, it brought us some relief. Until then, we had felt like we were losing our minds. Now, there was no question that we were being targeted by this man. After that, we packed up our belongings and moved to a different part of town. We didn't want to wait for the situation to escalate further. I still don't know what happened to that neighbor. He should have been charged with stalking, at the very least, but we didn't follow up on the case after we moved. In our new apartment, we made sure to pay extra for a unit on a higher floor. It was a little more expensive, but the added security and peace of mind were worth it. We've had no issues since then, but the experience left a lasting impression on us. Some people might think we overreacted, but will never regret taking those precautions. Feeling safe in your own home is priceless. You think you're alone, safe in your own home, until you hear a sound that chills you to the bone. What happens next will leave you questioning how well you really know your neighbors. I had always felt like there was something off about my neighbor, who we'll call Mr. Johnson. He lived a few doors down when I was growing up. Mr. Johnson lived alone in the largest house on the street, and nobody really knew anything about him. He was always quiet and kept to himself, but there was something about the way he looked at me that made me feel uneasy. I would see him in passing almost every day, but we never talked. He was about 50 years old, if I had to guess. He had short gray hair and a mustache, and he walked with a limp, though I never knew why. It wasn't until I was home alone one day that I discovered the true extent of his creepiness. It was a typical summer day, and I was playing video games in my room. My room was at the back of the house. When I gamed, I liked to tune out the rest of the world, so I closed my curtains and turned off the lights. I also wore a good noise-canceling headset. Suddenly, I felt like somebody had come home. That was strange because my parents weren't supposed to be back until the following day. Like I said, I couldn't hear anything, but I could feel the vibrations of footsteps stomping around the house. I was pretty sure someone had broken in. I paused my game and removed my headset, then listened closely, but the sound had stopped. I shrugged it off and continued playing. After a few minutes, it started again. This time it was stronger and more persistent. I could feel each step rattle through my body. I got up to investigate. Tiptoeing out of my room, I cautiously walked down the stairs. I peeked carefully around each corner as I made my way to the kitchen, which was where it seemed like the noise was coming from. When I entered the kitchen, I saw that one of the cabinets was open. I was sure I had closed it before I started playing, but now it was wide open. I approached the cabinet, my heart racing with fear. As I reached for the handle, I heard a voice behind me, looking for something. I froze. My blood ran cold as I turned around to see Mr. Johnson standing there, a knife in his hand and a sinister smile on his face. "What are you doing here?" I managed to stammer. My voice cracked, and my hands trembled as I took a step back. "Just checking on you," he said, his tone casual but laced with something menacing. "I noticed your parents were gone. Thought you might need some company." I could barely think. My fight or flight instincts kicked in, but I felt paralyzed. He started moving closer, and I knew I had to act fast. "I'm going to call the police," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Oh, I wouldn't do that," he replied, his grin widening. "You wouldn't want to make me angry, would you?" My phone was in my pocket, but I didn't dare reach for it while he was watching me. Desperate, I took a deep breath and bolted past him, running as fast as I could to the front door. He lunged after me but missed, and I managed to get outside and scream for help. Thankfully, a neighbor across the street heard me and came running. Mr. Johnson hesitated, then turned and fled out the back door. The police arrived shortly after, and I told them everything. They searched his house and found disturbing evidence, pictures of me and other kids in the neighborhood, along with journals detailing his twisted thoughts. He was arrested and sentenced to prison. I never saw him again. To this day, I still have nightmares about Mr. Johnson and the way he used to look at me. I moved out of that house as soon as I was old enough, and my parents moved shortly after. It's hard to think that things wouldn't have escalated beyond creepy. I'm sure if he hadn't been stopped, someone would have gotten hurt. It was a really close call, and by far the creepiest thing I've ever experienced. Have you ever wondered if the quietest person in your neighborhood might be hiding something? When our new neighbor moved in, we thought she was just shy. But what began as odd behavior turned into something far more unsettling, a mystery that lingered long after we left. About 10 years ago, a new neighbor moved into the house across from us in my old neighborhood. She was a woman in her mid-40s who lived alone and rarely interacted with anyone. If someone greeted her, she would smile politely and respond, but it was clear she wasn't interested in forming friendships. She often stayed inside her house, and on the rare occasions she came outside, it was either to take short walks or retrieve her mail. At first glance, she seemed friendly enough, but there was something odd about her demeanor. I was a kid at the time, and like most kids, I spent my afternoons playing outside with friends. We'd run around in the yard, laughing and shouting while she sat on her patio and watched us for hours. She didn't even try to hide it. Sometimes we'd glance over and see her sitting there, staring at us with an unsettling, blank expression. If she wasn't on her patio, she'd peek through her curtains, her eyes following our every move. It felt as though she was always watching us, even when we were inside our home. One evening, my family and I were sitting in the den, enjoying a relaxing night watching TV. Suddenly, the lights in front of our house flickered on, and we noticed a shadow moving near the window. It looked like someone was outside, but we couldn't make out their face. My dad got up to investigate. By the time he reached the front door, the person had vanished. He scanned the area but found nothing unusual. We brushed it off, assuming it was probably nothing, and went to bed. The next morning, however, my dad discovered something strange. The solar panel lights we'd stuck into the ground next to our driveway were gone. The soil where they'd been was visibly disturbed. As he backed out of the driveway to head to work, he glanced over at our neighbor's yard. There, lined up neatly next to her driveway, were all 5 of our missing solar lights exactly as we had arranged them. Amused but bewildered, he called my mom and me outside to take a look. Sure enough, the lights were there. Our neighbor, acting as if nothing was out of the ordinary, was outside watering her flowers. She gave us an awkward smile and a wave, but we didn't confront her. They were just cheap lights, after all, and not worth causing a scene over. Still, the incident marked the beginning of a series of odd events. Every year, our holiday decorations, whether for Christmas or Halloween, would mysteriously disappear or get damaged. None of our other neighbors had this problem. One Halloween, our carefully carved pumpkins vanished the night before the holiday. Frustrated, We eventually stopped decorating altogether. It didn't stop there. Our neighbor began copying everything we did. If we planted a certain type of flower in our garden, she would do the same the next day. If my mom wore a sun hat while gardening, our neighbor would show up the following afternoon wearing an identical one. If my parents and I were outside raking leaves, she'd grab a rake and start raking her yard, even if there weren't any leaves to gather. Despite everything, we never confronted her. She didn't seem dangerous, just peculiar. Over the years, we grew accustomed to her strange behavior. When we eventually moved to a new neighborhood, we felt a sense of relief. Our new neighbors were kind and respectful, a refreshing change from the unnerving presence of the woman who had once been our neighbor. Looking back, I still wonder, was she just eccentric, or was there something darker beneath her odd behavior?